Phil, let me start with you, if I could. And with that attack on Kharg Island, I'm going to read a bit from the Truth Social post the president posted last night about that attack. He said, "At my direction, the U.S. Central Command executed one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East," the president's words, "and totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Kharg Island. Our weapons," he writes, "are the most powerful and sophisticated that the world has ever known, but for reasons of decency, I have chosen not to wipe out the oil infrastructure on the island." Would love to get your perspective from your vantage of the significance of that. We know that 90% of the oil that Iran produces goes through this hub off the coast of Iran. How big a deal is this? And what does it signal to you that it wasn't a kind of full attack on the oil infrastructure on that island, Philip?
Well, first of all, it's certainly considered an escalation by Iran, because shortly thereafter comes the statement from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, says that because those attacks were staged here in the United Arab Emirates, by the way, without proof from Iran that was actually the case, but because of what they think were attacks that came from here, that cities and ports in the UAE are now not safe anymore and are legitimate targets. Iran also says that people here should now leave those places because attacks might be coming. Now, it's worth saying that that has already happened. Remember that the likes of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the biggest cities in the United Arab Emirates, have already seen drone attacks since the start of the US-Israeli war on Iran. But we have, though, as part of that Iranian escalation, at least in theory, we do have seen something concrete on the ground not too far from here. Just south from here in Fujairah is a very large oil facility that was struck earlier this morning by what presumably were Iranian drones. We do not have confirmation thereof, but there were two large columns of smoke billowing from that oil facility just a short while ago. Now, that is particularly important right now, because with the Strait of Hormuz, and you can see the entrance of it right behind me, with it essentially being closed, well, there are some ways of bypassing it to a lesser degree. There are pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that can bring oil away from the Persian Gulf and to other ports where oil can be picked up and where the Strait of Hormuz does not need to be used. And Fujairah, just down the road from here, is one of those. Now, a little note on the Strait of Hormuz. I just mentioned there is very little movement, and we have been watching it from our vantage point here. Almost no movement whatsoever. We can see dozens of ships here. Now, these are tankers that carry oil, but also natural gas. They are waiting to enter the Strait of Hormuz. And then there are hundreds in the Persian Gulf who are waiting to get out. So far, we've seen very little movement. We do know that some China-linked ships have made their way in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, and Iranian ships as well. A tiny, tiny exception they are. Essentially, what we're looking at here is pretty much a full-on blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
All right, I want to pivot to a different peninsula, and that's Jeff Mason, who is with the president in Florida. Jeff, in your latest piece, you've got a good breakdown of what the war is costing so far. U.S. officials told lawmakers the first 6 days of the war with Iran cost more than $11.3 billion, says a person familiar with the matter. How do you think that cost is going to go down with both members of Congress and the American public as this war, as the president has said, could go long, may not go long? We're going to have to wait till he feels it.
Yeah, I asked him that last night on the tarmac.
I heard you. I thought that was your voice when I was listening to that this morning, Jeff Mason.
Yes, you were spot on there, Christina. And he said it would last as long as necessary. And I think it's worth taking a pause to talk about that for a second, given that just a little over a week ago, I believe, when he was starting to feel politically sensitive to the price of oil and gasoline, he suggested that the war was going to end quickly. He didn't give a timeline then. He hasn't given a timeline now, but he has walked away from that language, and that action right there, verbal decision anyway, is something that I think markets are going to be sensitive to going forward. To your question about Congress, look, the president already has a sales pitch to make to Congress, certainly to Democrats, which I think he's probably much less concerned about. But more generally, there's already some tension there about the fact that he has launched a war in the Middle East without seeking permission from Congress. The Congress, as you well know, also controls the purse strings. And that amount of money is no doubt something that's going to get scrutinized. And as I like to mention, because politics is my wheelhouse, this is an election year, And this is also a president who campaigned on and in fact started his first year talking about government waste and about cutting down on government spending. Obviously, a war costs money. A war does not achieve those particular goals.
Dan Williams, let me turn to you. I want to ask about Israel's incursion into Lebanon, which has really escalated here, and I'm very curious about the end goals for Israel. I know that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was on the ground in Beirut in recent days. Let me play a bit of tape of what he said to both of those feuding parties, Lebanon and Israel.
My strong appeal to both parties, to Hezbollah and to Israel, is for a ceasefire to stop the war and pave the way to find a solution that would allow Lebanon to become a country independent, with sovereignty and territorial integrity respected.
The UN Secretary General saying he made that trip in solidarity, his word, with the Lebanese people. We see reporting from Axios this morning that Israel is planning to significantly expand its ground operation in Lebanon with the aim of dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure. That's according to Israeli and U.S. officials. Axios cites, quote, this could be the largest Israeli ground invasion of its northern neighbor since 2006, dragging Lebanon to the epicenter of the escalating war with Iran. Dan, I'm very curious what you're hearing from Israeli officials about the objectives of this military campaign, this effort here to encroach on, perhaps seize more territory in Lebanon.
Well, that's certainly the mood music. In fact, it was stated explicitly by the Israeli defense minister that, as he put it, the Lebanese state had failed to impose its authority over the entirety of Lebanon, meaning reining in that subnational group Hezbollah, a group that's clearly a cat's paw for Iran, a group that reopened the Lebanese front with Israel in solidarity with Iran a couple of days into this Gulf war, this Iran war that we've all been covering and dealing with. So the Israelis haven't said explicitly how deeply they're willing to go into southern Lebanon. They have ordered out civilians. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have now fled accordingly north of the Litani River, which is the natural demarcation of southern Lebanon. It makes up something like 10% of the Lebanese landmass there. If you believe the Axios report, Israel is willing to go all the way up to the Litani. Again, perhaps there is some saber rattling here, some muscle flexing, given that an invasion on that scale would really require a couple divisions worth of troops. The Israelis may need time to muster that number of men. They have been doing so in recent days. I'm not sure they would want to. I think they would still want to see the Lebanese state intervening, coming in at last moment to really impose its authority on Hezbollah. But given that Hezbollah, especially in recent days, has been escalating rocket attacks into northern Israel, Israel responding in kind, it would appear the escalation vector is very, very clear here.
Philip, I want to ask you, because you're in the area, you were talking about those stranded ships, and later on in the show, we're going to talk to a UN official about what these international agencies are trying to do to help the stranded sailors. About 20,000 stranded merchant marines and sailors on those vessels. 4 have already been killed, 7 injured, and at least 7 ships have been hit either by flying debris or other explosions in the region. What are the different governments trying to do? Are those vessels just sitting out there? Are these sailors coming into port? Are they getting supplies out there? Can you give us kind of a situation?
No, look, the truth is there is pretty much no movement whatsoever. A colleague of mine, though, today was in touch with one of the sailors on one of those tankers, in fact, waiting to go through the Strait of Hormuz. He actually told him that he felt a little bit like a sitting duck and was a little bit afraid that the oil company, or maybe the transport company, wasn't clear there who he mentioned, was feeling the pressure for financial reasons to actually move through the Strait of Hormuz despite the dangers. So that is the situation these seamen are in, essentially. The pressure to make money and to move through the Strait of Hormuz is huge. It's just right now that because of these recent Iranian attacks, and there have been several of them, as you mentioned, and the threats that more will be forthcoming, that the evaluation right now is simply it is too dangerous to move through the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance companies, as I'm sure you have spoken about over the last 2 weeks, insurance companies have skyrocketing rates, and they also, of course, deem it very, very dangerous indeed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So there is no movement here, not in and out of the strait and not towards any ports either. Now, generally, these are ships, and it is a generalization, but still, they tend to have enough provisions on board once they get close to the Strait of Hormuz, because they know, especially during this time, that something bad could happen and then they might get stuck. So in that sense, they should be okay. Now, what are governments doing? Of course, they want to get their citizens out, but there's very little they can do. That brings us on to an entirely different subject, in a sense, is what can foreign governments do to actually get these ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz? Of course, the Trump administration has spoken about the possibility of escorting ships. It's not something that is happening right now, and it's also something that is very hard to put into place. It is logistically very, very hard, and it's also a military option in a sense, because as long as Iran has the power, the firepower to attack ships and to use drones on cities here in the United Arab Emirates, well, then it should also be powerful enough to take on the US Navy if it brings in escort ships. Now, there's another attempt. France is involved in a potential international coalition to escort ships in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Again, that takes weeks to set up. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Jeff Mason, very quickly, want to wrap up with you here. We got about a minute left, and we're kind of threading through the conversation, comments we've gotten from the president to Brian Kilmeade and on President Trump's Truth Social site. He writes, the fake news media hates to report how well the U.S. military has done against Iran, which is totally defeated and wants a deal, but not a deal that I would accept. And we see this news that the U.S. is sending 2,500 additional Marines to the region. Your read on what that portends? It's going to take about a week for them to get there. What does it say about the president's appetite for a deal in the minute we have left?
Well, number one, I would say that the president is telling the truth when he says the war is going to go on as long as necessary. He does not. It doesn't seem to me like he has an end game in mind, and it does seem like he's prepared to increase resources to achieve the goals that he's looking for. I wouldn't take seriously what he or what Secretary Hegseth said yesterday about how the media should be covering the war. It's our job to cover it truthfully and factually, and not take tips from the government. But I would say, from an analytical perspective, it is not unrealistic to conclude that they're committed for a long term, even if that has a negative impact on the economy and a negative impact on the president's political prospects in November.